Hello, my friends. I would like to speak to you today about a type of meditation which comes from China. Now, in the past, I've looked at the yogic traditions of India. We looked at how meditation developed there several millennia ago, 5, 6, maybe even 7,000 years ago. There are recordings of people meditating there. And in our last series on the Brahma Viharas, we looked at how that tradition had started originally in India with the yogic traditions, and had later been developed by the Buddhist traditions through Buddha himself and through the later leaders of the Buddhist tradition, how that had developed into such an important set of virtues and the four immeasurables, as we looked at. So we looked at how that can influence our meditation. Well, if we go even further east to China, we can see many of these principles are very similar and have come from a common sort of theme, which to me gives me the idea that there is some deep spiritual truth in these things. I'm not religious in any way. I don't purport to be teaching you a religion. I'm neither teaching you about Hinduism, Buddhism, Taoism, or any other ism or any other religion. My role is just to facilitate those of you that want to get into meditation and who want to understand how meditation is such a transformative experience. And as a daily practice, it can change our lives. I would say it's a deeply spiritual experience, and I find that the spiritual side of us as human beings is the side that is most likely to be neglected in this life. We live very, very comfortable lives these days, don't we? Very fast-paced lives often. But to leave out the spiritual side is to leave out a vital element. And of course, none of us are going to be here forever. Even if we live for 100 years, the inevitability of our mortal life coming to an end is absolutely guaranteed. And I think that each one of us would like to know what there is beyond this particular mortal physical life, and also how anything that is beyond this mortal physical life can relate to our everyday lives, and how we can start to bring some of these principles into how we live our lives, how we relate to each other, how we relate to the world around us, to nature, to the cosmos, the universe, and to the divine, and that which is greater and beyond us. And as we've looked at before in our series, certainly the concept in the East is that we are all part of nature. We are all part of the universe. That which we see, which is wrapped up in this image that we have of ourselves, who we are, what we look like, what our occupation is, where we live, what our nationality is, what our race is, etc., is very superficial, because on a bigger scheme, we are, as human beings, all one particular species. And if we take that a level further, then we see that we are all inhabitants of the earth, and we all have a connection to the earth. Without so many elements that are basic to the earth, none of us would exist. We all breathe in oxygen every day, breathe out carbon dioxide. We rely on the trees. We rely on water, of which we are probably about 70% made. And water is a key element to the earth. And there's not that many planets that contain water in the way that we have it on earth. So we are intrinsically part of nature, part of the earth, and everything that's on earth is one great big ecosystem, if you like. Everything is eating something else, and everything will be eaten by something else eventually. But just to get back to the topic of today, without going off at a terrible tangent, which I am prone to do, I must admit. Taoism, it's actually pronounced Taoism, is a philosophy that comes from China. So to understand where Taoism comes from and what it means and the concept of it is the best way to understand the principles of the Tao and how the Tao relates to us and how it can be incorporated into our meditation. I have an absolutely fantastic meditation practice that comes from this, which I will be sharing in due course. So, China. If we go back about 2,500 years, something like that, to about 500 BCE, whichever your terminology is, then we find that there are the principles of the Tao and this teaching sort of begin, the first mentions of this. So that would be the root of where this philosophy comes from. So if you understand Chinese history, which I don't claim to be a scholar of, but my understanding is that there are two major philosophies that shaped China going back a couple of thousand years ago. And the first one that I would mention is Confucianism, as taught by Confucius. And Confucius was a philosopher who believed that everything should have an order and a sequence to it and a hierarchy almost, if you like. And he would give advice which is very good, very sound, moral, ethical advice about things like how society should be run, governments should be run, down to the level of families, family relationships, how different family members should relate to one another, how men and women should behave, how children should behave to their parents to their children, to rulers to their servants and their subjects, etc. Things like this. So everything was very much, there was an order to this whole belief that Confucius sort of laid out, and it was very, very influential in China. And it's the Chinese culture is credited a lot to the teachings of Confucius and the etiquettes and the principles and the morals and the ethics and all that sort of stuff come out of that sort of teaching. But it's quite a structured, it's quite a it's quite not, I wouldn't say bureaucratic, but I would say that it almost has a kind of a feel almost of a religious structured sort of system of beliefs and do's and don'ts, moral rights and wrongs and things like that, though it isn't purporting really to be a religion as such. It's more of a sort of a philosophy and a code of ethics. So on the one hand you have Confucianism, on the other hand Taoism is very much a philosophy that is not structured, not in the sense of Confucianism certainly, and there's almost a sense that when you're young you do your best, to fit in, be this good moral person of moral high standing, whatever, in that sort of Chinese culture. And then when you get to a certain age, it's almost like you sort of kind of check out a little bit, and you think, oh, I can kind of relax a little bit now in my kind of a older, middle-aged, old age, whatever. Like a lot of British people, they'll get to a certain age and they may look for, rather than to sort of continue their auspicious career to right up to their time of retirement, a lot of British people would maybe look for a sort of a employment that was not so arduous, not so strenuous, not so taxing on the brain perhaps, but something to which they can kind of almost sort of wind down from this busy life, as it were. And the Chinese, no, not really that much different from that, in that get to a certain age and then there is the desire to kind of wind down a little bit. And in terms of ethics, philosophy, religious, spiritual sort of terms, then this, for many Chinese, is where Taoism comes in, because it's the point at which we start sort of looking strictly towards these kind of strict rules and regulations, not so much rules and regulations, but kind of sort of structured philosophical, ethical codes that are found in the teachings of Confucius, to the teachings of the Tao. Now, the major work is, which I have a copy of here, the Tao Te Ching, as it's pronounced. It doesn't transliterate particularly well into English. As it was translated, it looks like it should say Tao Te Ching, but it's actually pronounced Tao Te Ching. Sort of poor transliteration, shall we say. But this book was written by a guy by the name of Lao Tzu. Lao Tzu, whose name is on here. And he was a very wise philosopher in ancient China. And the story goes that he was elderly, and he wanted, for the last part of his years, after having advised rulers, spiritual seekers, intellectual people, etc., after having advised them for many, many decades, he was about to leave China to go to another region. Maybe he was going to the Himalayas. That's area of great sort of spiritual discovery. I don't know. It doesn't really recorded where he was going, but he was about to leave the borders of China. And before he went, the border guard, the person who was there at the gate, said to him, Sir Lao Tzu, you must not go without kind of leaving us your wisdom behind, giving us something for posterity from your teaching. So the story is that Lao Tzu went, and before leaving the country, he went down and he penned this work. It's not a big, thick tome. It's not like your Bibles or your Qurans or the Bhagavad Gitas or Mahabharata or whatever. It's not one of these big, weighty tomes. It's actually quite a small book. But the words of this particular work are absolutely, they're quite mind-blowingly profound, but in a simple way that you read it and you almost think, reading it, it almost seems like a little bit of common sense almost. But what the Tao Te Ching describes is a system which is based on the Tao. What is the Tao? Well, I've put down on at the top of here for a start. The Tao literally means the way, the path. And another translation of the term Tao is actually the word, the spoken word, a word that is spoken. So when we're speaking about this, the term itself, Tao, is a term that when the Bible was being translated into Chinese, there's a word in the New Testament which is the Greek word logos, which means the spoken word. And when we read at the start of John's Gospel about the Word, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, then that particular word for word is the word logos. It's talking about a word that's spoken out, as it were. And when the Bible was translated into Chinese, the word Tao was the word that was exchanged for this word logos. So as the Chinese Bible says, in the beginning was the Tao, and the Tao was with God, and the Tao was God. So, but to say that is kind of strange to the mentality of the Taoist and the Chinese culture, because the whole idea and notion of the Tao being God, as in this figure, this kind of white-haired old man sitting in the clouds with a long white beard, no relation, by the way, is kind of a bit foreign and a bit alien to this Chinese philosophy, because the Tao is not really speaking of God or a source, ruler of the universe in the terms of a personality. If you like, it's almost like a force of nature. In fact, it's speaking of what could be described as the course of nature. In the first chapter of the Tao Te Ching, we read that the Tao that can be defined is not the eternal Tao. So it is a concept almost which, though we're speaking about it, and I'm speaking about it to you, and you might be thinking, well, if you can't define it and you can't put your finger on it and you can't really, it's a bit kind of ethereal in a sense, then why are you kind of rabbiting on about this particular concept? But I'm just trying to get across to you the idea that the Tao is almost like a sort of a force, if you like. In fact, it has been said on many occasions, and I believe it to be excuse me, authenticated, that George Lucas, when he was writing his Star Wars stories, excuse me one moment, used the concept of the Tao as the basis for his idea about the Force in the Star Wars films. And some have said that the Jedi characters in the Star Wars films are very similar to this concept of the wise Taoist monk or follower, devotee of the Tao. So what are we actually looking at here? Well, if you have to kind of, as I say, it's very hard to define. It's very hard to put your finger on what the Tao is. But if you can think along the lines of the idea of something like Mother Nature, or a system which holds everything together, something which is almost like a programmed sequence almost, though not programmed in a kind of mathematical, structured, ordered way, but something that flows more so. So in nature, if we look at nature, we don't see the kind of man-made structure and order that we like to put into the world. You know, we like to kind of put all these right angles and straight lines and geometrically perfect sort of shapes together, you know, using a set square and measurements and things like this. If we look in nature, we see a lot of recurring patterns, but there's an awful lot of abstract, which is based upon often recurring sort of patterns and symbols. But you don't sort of see those hard edges, those hard definitions of lines. And yet, nature and the animal kingdom, the plant kingdom, everything that you see on Earth, geology, everything, has got a certain order to it and a complexity that mankind has never and probably never will approach the ability to sort of emulate that. I mean, if we just look at the human body, for instance, and all of the way all of the parts of the human body all work together, just looking at the brain and all of the absolutely millions of kind of neural pathways and connections in the human brain, it's an absolute marvel. And of course, those that believe in an intelligent design, those religions that believe in an intelligent design, lay claim to this being the proof of a creator, of a God, of a being who planned out all of this. I would go to say that the Tao doesn't, as I say, doesn't speak of a God and a being in that sense. It's almost like the Tao is almost like a personality and yet a force at the same time. As I say, it's kind of indefinable, indescribable in one sense, but it's something that underpins everything. It's something that runs through everything. It's something that runs through the grain of wood, the ripples on a lake, on a pond, the wind, the weather, our DNA, what gives us life, etc. And the understanding is that without the Tao, nothing would exist. That the Tao was there before anything did exist. And of course, the one difficulty that some people have with the idea of a God as a personality is that, well, if God looks after everything, makes everything, puts everything together, then who kind of looks after God and who put God here in the first place? So the idea of the Tao is not so much of one personality who fulfills that role, but a whole kind of system that holds us all together, that runs through us and holds us all together. So we can see aspects of a lot of the Eastern philosophies running through the Tao. Anyway, I won't go into it too much because I will come back to this. This is my introduction, if you like, to Taoist meditation, which I probably should have said at the start. So to avoid any confusion, this is my introduction to Taoist meditation, for which I felt the need to go through a few of the key points of what the philosophy of Taoism is. So that's the Tao, basically, from the teaching of Lao Tzu, and went on to be a lot of other people that came after Lao Tzu as well that elaborated on these things, but that was the start of it. The second term, from which kind of holds everything together and tries to not explain the Tao as such, because as I say, it's kind of unexplainable really in one sense. We have the concept, and I'm sure that you've all seen this symbol, the symbol of the yin and the yang. The yin being the dark part of this circle, the semicircle, the part that's dark there, black, and the yang being the white part. And you'll notice that for both halves of the pattern, we have in the black yin, we have a white circle, and in the white yang, we have a black circle. And the whole concept is that yin and yang represent the two sides of a hill or a mountain. So the shady side of the hill is the yin side. The light, sunny side of the hill is the yang side. And that's why we have the light and the dark. So from that, basically we're looking at a polarity, if you like, two sides of one coin. So the dark side would be seen as the negative, not negative as in bad negative, you understand, but negative more like the polarity of a battery or a magnet. So we've got a positive, a negative and a positive, yang being the positive. So synonymous with the yang side would be the sun, shade or the moon would be with the yin. So we're looking at dark, light. The yin side is seen to be more passive, if you like, more peaceful, passive, still. It's seen as the feminine side, whereas the yang is seen as more the active, masculine side. And another interesting point is the fact that the binary system, which I believe was developed by a guy called Leibniz, was derived from the yin and yang system, because the yin and yang, another symbol for it, there are broken and unbroken lines. And so we understand also the computer language now is based on this binary system of ones and zeros, on and off, if you like. So to kind of explain what I'm getting at here and how this applies to meditation or how it applies to the Tao, the whole concept of yin and yang is that everything in existence has two sides to it, if you like. For every up there's a down, for every left there's a right, for every east there's a west, north there's a south. Then of course you've got black and white, light and shade, all of this. There's not opposite to everything, but there's an understanding that the two things are mutually interconnected. There's a mutual interconnectivity between those two things. You cannot have one without the other. I mean, if we just look at long and short, you can't have only one. Now this is where Western philosophy has kind of diversified, if you like. We don't really see this in Western philosophy so much, because in Western philosophy and Western kind of aspirations, if you like, we're always wanting to have the best, the most, the biggest, the greatest, the good as opposed to the bad. Now, even in yin and yang we see good and evil, but we see them as this constant interplay between light and dark, if you like. As I said, going back to George Lucas and the Star Wars stories, you see, the dark side of the Force and the light side of the Force, whatever. So you've kind of got this, you've got these two the flip side of each other. But the whole concept of it is that you cannot have the one without the other. If you say only had short sticks, then they wouldn't be short, because they would be if all the sticks were the same size and they were all short, then they wouldn't be short, would they? You have to have long sticks in order to have short sticks. You have to have light in order to have darkness, because if it wasn't for light, everything would be dark, so there wouldn't be such a thing as dark. And if you reverse it the other way, if everything was light, there wouldn't be any darkness. So in order for anything to exist, to subsist, to make any sense, there has to be a comparison with one another. Now, the reason why we often come unstuck in our way of thinking that has developed in the Western world is that, as I say, we are constantly striving to almost do away with what we see as the negative side. We try to unsuccessfully do away with things like poverty. Let's make everybody rich. Unfortunately, there's always somebody more rich or less rich or whatever. There's always a comparison. But that's the idea, that, this is better than that. You have to have something to compare to, as it were, in this Western philosophy. And the big kind of, if you want to take it to the extreme, you're talking about things like life and death. Now, in the Eastern world, it's different to the Western world. In the Western concept of things, you almost have this idea that death leads to complete obliteration and lack, non-existence, if you like, at the point of death. We kind of have this life and then we cease to exist. So it's like it's all up and then there's then nothing. But of course, if we look at nature, if you just look at a tree and you see the cycles of nature, at the moment the last of the leaves are dropping off the trees here, because it's the start of winter, it's the end of autumn, and there's almost a sort of a type of death, though it's not death, it's almost like the trees sort of go to sleep, really, if you like. But there is a cycle, because we know that when the spring comes around, the blossom will come on the trees, and then the leaf buds, and then the trees will have their leaves and they'll grow fruit, etc., etc. It's a cycle that goes around. And if we understand our lives to be a cycle, we can see that we have to be born, have a life, and then at some point we will die. But of course, the Eastern philosophy is not that death is an end, it's just a recycling as such. Reincarnation is like a recycling. It's a cycle that goes round, and life continues, but in another form, in another state. Not to say that Taoism talks about reincarnation in the way that Hinduism or Buddhism talks about this kind of wheel of samsara as such. It's not that, but there is an understanding that to everything there is a season, and everything there is light and dark. There is one side and there's another side. Okay, so the final element that I want to talk about, which kind of ties some of this together, is the concept of Wu Wei. And Wu Wei literally means doing, not doing, or it's kind of a not doing, a not grasping at, it's not holding on to something. Now, if we look at nature, we'll see that things like water has a natural flow to it. So it starts at a high point in the mountains, it flows down in streams, into rivers, and bigger rivers, and eventually into the sea. and of course, as we know, we get evaporation into the clouds, and those clouds rain on the mountains, and so we have a complete cycle. Water is a sort of a cycle, and water is an incredibly powerful force as well, and yet it's incredibly soft, that we can, hold it in our hands, wash our hands with it. It's non obtrusive in that it's not an aggressive thing. It's not a forceful. It's not like in its very nature. It's not kind of an aggressive thing that's kind of pressurizing, and yet it has all of the potential. Certainly, when you look at the waves of the ocean. And I had an experience recently this year where I nearly drowned in the Atlantic Ocean. One moment the sea was fairly calm and there were a few waves. The next moment I was swept out, and had it not been for somebody that came along and rescued me, then I wouldn't have been here to tell you the tale. But things like this make us respect nature, respect water, for instance. So it's been described as almost like the way of water. The Tao has, and Wu Wei has, really, but it's like the whole idea of Wu Wei is to go with the course of nature. So if we look at something like the grain in wood, we see that it has a certain flows in a certain direction. And if you are somebody that, as an artist, that's carving things from wood, then you'll know that you need to work with the grain. If you're making furniture, you need to work with the grain, and the grain almost suggests the pattern that should be followed. If we go with the flow, then we will have success. If you go against the flow, we will be up against all sorts of problems. As I say, it is with water. And probably one of the best analogies that I can use for Wu Wei is the analogy of sailing. Now, if you want to travel from A to B across the sea, down a river, etc., then the best way to go is not. We can use a rowing boat with oars to go across the lake or across the sea, but we're using sort of brute strength, if you like. That would be one way of doing it, but the intelligent way to do it, and to do it more quickly, would be actually to use the wind and the tides as well, to a certain extent. And so sailing really kind of encapsulates this notion of what Wu Wei is. It's we can't sail against the wind if we're sailing, but what we can do is we can tack into the wind, which is a kind of a zigzag pattern that we would take. So by using the sails on a sailing boat, we could use those sails so that we can go this way and that, and eventually we can get to our destination using the wind. So that's one example. Another example that we see so we're using almost the force of nature. We're using something that's already flowing. Another example is the Japanese art of judo, which the concept is not to kind of go against an attacker who's coming against you full force, to kind of block what's happening, to kind of push against it. But the idea with judo is to actually use the opponent's direction of flow of his attack to actually undermine it. So there's an extent to which, as an attacker goes to put a blow on his opponent, the opponent grabs the arm and pulls it towards him or her, and then there's an element of almost like turning and spinning as well. And the whole idea is that to take the force of that blow, of that movement, it can be generated in to actually turn the opponent against himself, to trip himself up, and so the attacker is felled by his opponent using the method of judo. And the do in judo is actually excuse me, a transliteration into Japanese of the Chinese Dao. So Dao and Do could be seen as the same sort of word, really. So excuse me. So the whole principle of Taoism utilizes the very force of nature itself, and the Tao itself is the course of nature, the way everything works, the way it all flows together in this almost sort of like a mystical sort of sense. But it's something that we can all see. We can go out into nature and we can see it. And every one of us can choose in our lives whether we want to work against the system of nature and the course of nature, or whether we want to go with it. And certainly in the modern world, we can see the dangers and the problems from going against nature with things like climate change, global warming, etc., deforestation, all of these things. As human beings, we've completely kind of trashed the earth to the point where we have definitely gone against and tried to go against the force of nature. But as King Canute in times of old, who sat on the beach and tried to command the waves not to come in, it's pretty useless, because in the end of the day, I totally believe that nature will prevail against mankind if mankind continues to resist nature and continues to strive against nature. Then it will eventually be man's downfall. You know, we're destroying the very oxygen that we breathe, that keeps us alive. The very water that we consist of is being polluted and, you know, kind of spoilt, really. But nature will prevail. We can't get rid of nature. We can't destroy nature, because nature is powerful. The Tao is powerful, but it has a gentle flow, which we can see through all of these. And there are two sides to everything. This is a natural thing. We shouldn't try to hold on to the part that we like and completely destroy the other side. There's that story which you may have heard back to the days of the early days of communist China, when they decided that because the sparrows were attacking the crops, the rice harvest, or I'm not sure this is rice or some of the crop, but the birds were coming down and they were kind of eating the crops, if you like. So they had a big sort of cull where they netted all of these birds and caught them, and thought, well, fantastic, you know, that we'll have a much bumper crop now. But of course, what happened was a load of pests, insects and other creatures that the birds had been eating from the crops came in and ate the crop. So in our infinite wisdom, really, we would be far more mindful to pay attention to nature, work with nature, and work with the Tao, as it's known. So how does this relate to meditation? Well, what I want to introduce you to is a very powerful form of meditation that comes from the Taoist tradition, and it's known as Zuowang. Zuowang, Zuowang, as we would spell it in our form of writing. And what it literally means is sitting and forgetting. Sitting and forgetting. It's a very simple practice, and what it involves is to basically relax. So we would relax as we normally would do in our meditation posture with a straight spine. And certainly the Taoists would adopt the classical meditation posture of probably something like the lotus position with crossed legs, or possibly sitting on a stool, a kneeling stool, something like that, keeping the back nice and straight. And they would sit possibly outside, possibly inside, but it's, again, nature can be incorporated into this as well. So the idea would be to relax. So for myself personally, I would use a body scan probably. I may go through a few preliminary steps, whatever my practice is. But in order to incorporate Zuowang into my meditation, I would sit. But as opposed to sort of some of the meditations that we've looked at before, like the yogic traditions, the Buddhist traditions, when we looked at the Brahma Viharas and these particular affirmations about wishing good to others, loving kindness, and all these other different aspirations that we would give to other people and other beings. The concept of Zuowang is to literally sit there, to become aware of ourselves in our bodies, which could be facilitated through the body scan. But it would then be to move on, and first of all it would be to go and notice what our five senses are telling us, any sensations that we had, and then it would be to literally let that pass. So it would almost be a forgetting of those sensations. Of course they're going to keep coming, but all of the five senses that come, whether it's a sound that we're hearing, so we close our eyes and we can hear background noises. I can hear a dog barking, or we might be able to hear a bit of traffic noise or some street noise, or maybe some voices in the background there. So as with the consciousness awareness idea, we would be aware of these things, but we wouldn't focus on them. And Zuowang is similar, because we would be aware of those sensations and we would be sensing them through our five senses, but we would then allow them to pass, just like sort of clouds passing that sky again. So we wouldn't dwell on them, but we wouldn't have any particular focus of our attention as such. We wouldn't be focusing on a particular thing. We would be aware of our breath, yes, and of course that's something that we can, if we're used to meditating, we can always come back to the breath, because it's a natural thing to focus on, as we've looked at before. But with Zuowang, we would be aware of our general environment around us, but we would relax and we would forget. And as I've mentioned many times, getting into that meditative zone is almost like a holiday. It's like a break. It's like I sit down, I give myself some time here to be on my own, in the solitude, in the peace, in the silence. And with Zuowang, we sit there, we allow everything to happen around us, and we just sit. And we forget. If any thoughts come into our minds, we see the thoughts as being exactly the same as a sound, as a smell, as a taste in our mouth, as an ache in the body. We would see the thoughts, and we would see them passively as just something that was going on in our minds, passing through, but we wouldn't focus on it. We would allow ourselves to just sit and allow everything to go on around us. So it's a far more fluid, relaxed form of meditation, if you like. And I think for me, probably the epitome of this would be to kind of just be able to sit out in nature somewhere. It's November at the moment, so where I live, I'm not really going to be sitting outside very much for very long, because it's rather cold. It's kind of hovering around the 0 degree point at the moment. So I'm going to be indoors at the moment with my practice. But certainly if you're somewhere where it's warm, dry and not uncomfortable to sit outside, it's wonderful if you can find a fairly peaceful place, so there are not going to be any loud crashing noises and disturbances and things like that. To just be able to sit there and just allow these happenings to go on around us, and to just see the thoughts as other happenings in the same way. So there's no special rules. I'm not going to give you any special mudras, although there are many, and you can, if you want to look back on some of the previous videos, you'll find some. One that I often like is to do this mudra, because this one relates to the root chakra and it's earth again, so we've got that. And of course there's the cosmic mudra, which reminds us that we are all part of the cosmos, which is this whole system of nature, the everything that's going around us in our lives anyway. So yeah, it's a pretty simple one, but it's pretty profound. And I find personally that to sit and to practice Zuowang meditation is a very powerful one. And what happens with it, as we sit there, we notice everything that's going around us, and we gradually forget, and we gradually allow it all to pass away, and then we start to focus inwards on ourselves. We start to focus on what's going on inside us. So it's a good way of starting to come inside and see what's really going on in the deep parts of us. And as we've looked at before, sometimes that can bring up possibly sometimes some emotions and some past memories and things like that. But again, we can sit and we can forget, we can let them go. And all of these are things that we are clearing out of our system. There's no goal to it, there's no end to it. The whole idea with Taoism is there's no particular target, there's no kind of particular idea that we're going to reach enlightenment, samsara, samadhi, nirvana, etc. It's just literally sitting there and becoming one with nature and everything that's around us. So this is my introduction anyway to Taoist meditation. I hope it made some sense. If it did, if you enjoyed it, please give us a thumbs up. If you have any comments or any questions, I welcome them. Please pop them in the box below. If you want to see more videos like this, if you want to have a look at some other types of meditation, or you want to follow this course, then please subscribe to this particular channel as well. Other than that, next time we'll have a look at the Tao in a little bit more detail, and so all that's to be said is I will see you next time, and until next time, Namaskaram.